I am very grateful to be presenting today on some research that I performed in collaboration with economist Sami Kitmitto and with funding from the ECMC Foundation on the relative returns to credential and non-credential skills attainment. I'll talk about these findings briefly, and then I look forward to hearing comments from two esteemed panelists. Joining me here on screen, Dr. Irma Perez-Johnson, who is a vice president at the American Institutes for Research and director of our workforce program area, and Mr. Scott Cheney, who is the CEO of Credential Engine. Dr. Perez-Johnson is an expert in employment, adult training, and K-12 interventions with a particular focus on their ability to improve outcomes across a range of policy contexts. She brings more than 20 years experience and has led studies in job search assistance, welfare to work transitions, occupation skills and vocational training, entrepreneurship and self-employment and unemployment insurance. And Mr. Scott Cheney leads Credential Engine's efforts to bring transparency to credentials. With more than 25 years experience in skills development across many sectors, including in the US Senate, he brings a rich and nuanced policy perspective to developing the skills of the US workforce to meet the needs of the economy. So, Scott and Irma, I welcome you to go off camera now as I transition to talking a bit about the findings that we'll all be commenting on today. And again, as I go through these findings, if something comes up, a question, feel free to put it in the chat, and we will come back to these questions in the discussion after we hear a few comments from Scott and Irma. So again, please keep yourselves on mute just for a short while longer. As I said, I'm going to be presenting on findings on the relative returns to credit and non-credit credential attainment. And this is work performed in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Sami Kitmitto. We are going to start today with just a little bit of background before I go into the data and methods and findings, only quite briefly because I'm interested to hear how the conversation evolves, but I'm more than happy to answer additional questions if they come up. So the labor market is changing rapidly. I think we all know this. There's increasing demand for postsecondary training in the labor market, but interestingly, not for a four-year degree as much as for credentials that come before a four-year degree, but after a high school degree, so-called middle skills training. And in fact, one report suggests that more than half of the demand in the labor market right now is for these middle skills, as much as 53%, that is. With the change in demand, there's also been a change in the supply for these kinds of credential attainment. And one of the more recent changes is the rapid growth in non-credit bearing skills programs. Now, these programs are exciting and novel for their ability to provide really skills adaptive solutions that are often faster turnaround than more traditional credit bearing programs. But there's a lack of evidence on the utility of these programs for their participants. And that is what this study aims to take on. We studied what are the relative returns to credit and non-credit bearing programs. And our primary outcomes are employment and earnings. And because earnings is hourly wage and hours worked, we looked at those outcomes too, and I'll talk about those briefly. The data we used for the study are 20 years of the National Longitudinal Survey, 1997. We follow individuals in a balanced panel from their ages 18 to 30 across the years of 1997 to 2016. The primary innovation of our strategy is an individual fixed effects model. I'm sorry, I guess I was muted there. The benefit of an individual fixed effects model is in its ability to control for persistent differences within a person over time. So just differences that are persistent over time, but within person. So these include observed differences like race and gender, and also unobserved differences like motivation or ability, to the extent that those are consistent over time. This is a really useful strategy because a lot of the challenge with estimating the returns to any kind of skills attainment is understanding the degree to which the differences we see in outcomes is attributable to differences in the types of people that take on these types of training programs. We also include controls for employment and earnings during the period of skills attainment, so while you're in school, because the research suggests that there are differences systematically in the types of training you take on in your likelihood to be working. And we also control for things that change over the life course that may affect the types of programs you choose into, like your marital status, number of children, age by race, and age by gender effects. Because we're really interested in understanding the utility of middle skills programs for folks who don't go all the way through to get a bachelor's degree straight out of high school, we constrained the sample only to individuals who didn't attain a 4-year degree within 6 years of graduating high school. And at the end of the day, we're left with a little bit more than 6,000 survey respondents. So what I'm showing here are some descriptive findings. On the left, you see the percentage employed across the sample according to their ultimate skills attainment. So if they, in our period of interest, ever got a credit or non-credit bearing credential, they would be in the blue line for credit bearing and in the black line for non-credit bearing. And on the right, you see earnings. Again, the blue line represents credit-bearing credential earnings. If they ever attained a credit-bearing credential, their earnings across ages 18 to 30, and then the black line, non-credit-bearing credential. And what you see here is they are strongly coupled, especially through the 20s. There seems to be some divergence as we approach the late 20s and go into the 30s. But it's important to note this isn't exactly the replication of the strategy that we employed, because this is your ultimate attainment and then the profile of your earnings, where the strategy that we used looks at the change in your employment and earnings after attainment. And so when we apply that strategy, like I talked about before, what we find is that the differences that we see in credit-bearing employment, shown in column 1 in that blue box, are small and not statistically significant. So we see a 1.7% improvement in your likelihood to be employed, but that's not statistically different from 0. We do see statistical differences in earnings, 0.15, and you have to do a transformation because it's a natural log, and we do that for you on this screen. And that's about that 0.15 represents about a 17% increase in your earnings for credit-bearing credential attainers. That is not as big as the change in your earnings as we might expect for receiving a 4-year degree, but it is notable, especially since we compare it. So it's a 17% above non-credit-bearing credential attainers who earn an average of $33,000 a year annually. All these numbers are in 2016 dollars. And so that represents an improvement of about $5,500 a year, which is, we think, significant and meaningful. So our findings show that credit-bearing attainment is likely associated with an improvement in annual earnings. We see these improvements in both hours worked and wages. And we think that this means it's important for policymakers and institutions to continue to provide pathways to credit-bearing attainment for a broad spectrum of individuals as much as possible. So with that, I won't say too much more about my research right now. And I'm going to invite Irma and Scott to come back on screen with me. And I'm so looking forward to hearing their thoughts. If you have thoughts, please put them in the chat. But I'm going to start today with asking you, Irma, tell us a little bit about how these findings appear to resonate with what we see in the literature, and if there's anything that should cause us to doubt what we're seeing here.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Candace. First, let me just say how delighted I am to be part of this panel, and I really want to commend you and Sami for taking on this important issue. It's like this critical question that we're all concerned about. Just sort of going directly to your question, I don't think there's really any reason to doubt your findings. I think they're, in fact, a terrific contribution to our overall knowledge base in the field of employment and training. But I think it's important to highlight, a number of things that are specific to the study and the way in which it contributes. So first, I would highlight that its principal contribution is that it empirically confirms, in a way, an intuition we've had about why credential versus how credential versus non-credential programs are different. Generally, as you pointed out, credential programs tend to be a little bit more, credit-bearing programs tend to be a little bit more expensive. And that is because we anticipate that they will impart some additional benefits to the individuals who purchase those as compared to non-credit-bearing, their non-credit-bearing alternatives. So your study, in fact, confirms that, looking at the data, and actually quantifies the benefit, sort of the level of the magnitude of that benefit. It would translate into about $5,000 a year in earnings, which, if you think about the fact that these are young labor market entrants over the course of their full careers, is a non-trivial amount. Sort of these benefits have a cumulative effect. So I think your study is very good. It does a great job in laying that out and highlighting the importance of these findings and their policy implications. But it's very important to also highlight that your findings are based on a sample of young workers. As you noted, individuals who, for the most part, were making decisions early in their careers about education and training, did not necessarily aim for a 4-year degree. We're aiming for something less than that, but had been successful in completing high school. And then chose a credential versus a non-credential bearing certificate or some type of program. So it's particularly important to recognize that and not necessarily try to extrapolate, from this study to the potential implications of these findings for individuals who may be making decisions about their careers and the need for training or further skill building at different points in time in their lives. Another point that I think is really worthy of highlighting about your findings is that your data ends in 2016. And I mean, this is just the data that are available, is the best available data, so you've done a terrific job with the data that are available. But it's important to recognize that the last decade has been a period where we've seen a strong shift towards the integration of credit-bearing courses and certifications into a wide range of the types of programs that would have fallen in the non-credit bearing bucket in your study: apprenticeships, post-secondary CTE career pathways, and other programs and other types of certification programs. So the field has already been moving in that direction, and so we'd expect some potential shifting, and perhaps in the proportion of people who take who primarily rely on non-credit bearing options. But this is an empirical question. I think it's something that we should continue to look at and explore over time. I would also note that non-credit certificates and other similar credentials are still being offered. And I don't think any of us would really expect them to go away. And this is because they fill a particular need in our market for employment and training. In particular for skill building, upskilling, reskilling, and outskilling that, in an efficient way. And this is important, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we should anticipate to have millions of Americans who have been permanently displaced from their jobs, who will be looking, as the economy recovers, for productive but efficient ways to get back on a pathway to a good job in a high growth industry that leads to livable wage jobs and career pathways in what is fundamentally a disrupted economy at this point in time. We've had a number of industries that have been decimated by the pandemic, may take a long time to come back. Trends of automation and greater integration of technology have surely been accelerated. And again, for these individuals, they'll be looking for efficient pathways to get back into good jobs as quickly as possible. And these kinds of certifications will be an important part of the constellation of options they'll want to consider. And for that, they'll need a lot of really good information on what these options will do and not do for them, and perhaps some counseling and support in weighing these options. And that's why I'm just delighted to be part of the panel with Scott, who's taken on that challenge of building the base of information that is available to people making these kinds of decisions.
Yes, thank you. Scott, we are very interested to hear how you interpret these findings in this fast-changing world. How does this focus on credit bearing square with where you interpret as where we should be focused?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be on this panel with Irma. So thank you again. I want to just connect myself with everything that Irma said. I think the report is really good. I think it's really important. I think it contributes to our understanding about the status of the economy as it's been, and given obviously the factors that Irma pointed to, we have a good picture with this report and others about how things have been. And I see, like Irma, the recognition that there's been an enormous change in a very short period of time in so many things that employers face, that learners face, the funding challenges that we have. There's an opportunity here, I think, to take what we've known about what's been and to rethink what we need to know about where we need to go. And I think that's really an opportunity that we have looking at this and thinking about what comes next. So many news reports coming out, so many articles, so many research pieces, and I'll just try and point to a few. I was just noticing today that there is a new Strata report showing that there are more and more young people who are less interested in pursuing a degree pathway, right? The concern about time, the concern about money. I think that's an important factor to take into account here as we think about the implications of your research, because we have evidence that credit-bearing programs are more valuable in the economy, but fewer individuals, and credit-bearing obviously being a very large swath of opportunities, but fewer young people thinking that that's the direction that they may want to go, or at least through a 4-year credit-bearing program, right? So how do we think about the implications of this just in engaging people and having the best policies and practices in place? I think about this also in terms of the report that we recently put out that indicates there are now nearly 1 million unique credentials in the marketplace. The vast majority of those are no longer in the traditional credit-bearing, degree-based programs that we've always kind of oriented our education and training around. And that I think, honestly, a lot of our employers and a lot of our labor markets have oriented themselves around, which may in fact have contributed to the willingness and the knee-jerk reaction of rewarding those kind of credentials more, because that's what we've always valued and looked to have people go into. And I think there's an opportunity now to think about how do we actually value and structure non-credit programs in ways that can be more valuable to individuals and the economy. Which really brings me to the question that you asked is, we see a lot of movement toward skills-based hiring, or at least a lot of conversation around skills-based hiring, skills-based development. It's a big push of a lot of big institutions, you know, the Business Roundtable and a lot of labor unions and a lot of other organizations. And I think you're going to see a lot of focus on that conversation in this administration. How is that going to affect the kind of systems that we have in place now? Is it going to take, and is it going to really drive a rethinking about how do we provide short-term non-credit opportunities in better ways that they connect to each other better, they transfer better, they're actually part of articulated, meaningful pathways. We have funding mechanisms that follow them better, so that we recognize that as more people are less interested in starting their education and career pathways heading to a 4-year degree, we don't have it be an either-or conversation. We have it be a start where you need to start, get where you need to get, and then let's help make sure that you see as many openings as possible with as many supports as possible to get you there. It's sort of recognizing that there are amazingly good non-credit programs, and there are some rather unsavory for-credit programs, right? And there's a mix in both worlds. Neither's a monolith. So how do we get out of the credit, non-credit maybe conversation, and how do we get to what are the right structures around both of those sides to connect them to each other, to recognize that more and more as you earn a 4-year degree, you're earning multiple credentials on that pathway, and how do we value all of those? And how do we help every individual make the most of those and help employers understand everything that's in them? And I was on a phone call earlier today with a team that's working on the incremental credentials as you go initiative out of SUNY, really thinking about how do we make sure people get the most recognition and the most value out of every step they take on that pathway, so that we don't minimize the likelihood of having the greatest outcomes. I actually think the challenge in front of us is to make all aspects of this pathway richer and stronger, not to say we're only going to direct people toward credit bearing, because I just don't think that's the practical and realistic approach to take in a policy sense, given the economy we're in right now.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I really appreciate your bringing to light how many credentials there are out there. And as people are trying to navigate this, you know, increasingly challenging world to understand, what recommendations do you have, Irma and Scott, for strategies that we can help them with to figure out the best path for them?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that question, Candace, and in particular reflecting about on my work over decades with the American workforce system. One of the things I would highlight is that, you know, we have an infrastructure in our country like to help individuals make sense of, you know, this constellation of options that are available, and at least sort of, you know, monitor for quality and make available information to support informed decision making. But what I would highlight is that infrastructure is woefully inadequate, you know, for the scale and breadth of the need and the challenge that we face at this point in time. So specifically, I'm referring to the network of American job centers that the U.S. Department of Labor supports with funding from the Workforce Investment, Innovation and Opportunity Act. These resource centers sort of provide, make available decision-making tools and supports, you know, that are available to anyone. You know, and generally can help with job search assistance, with training decisions. Many of their platforms, their decision-making support systems are available online. You know, sort of, so one does not even need to step foot into an American job center. But these decisions are complex, like people oftentimes need help making sense of the information and making sure that they've considered all of the factors that may influence their success or sort of may make one program versus another more appropriate for them. And that's where generally, like, the system just does not have the capacity to support as many individuals as need help with this kind of decision making. The counseling staff in American Job Centers work over the course of their careers with thousands of individuals making these types of decisions. So they have protocols, they have processes, they have strategies they use to ensure that people identify the options that may be well suited to the kinds of training they're looking for, that, sort of they use, they refer to menus or like databases that at least sort of screen for good outcomes, state approved options and the like, and that are well aligned to jobs and industries and sectors that are expected to continue to grow in the economy. So these are all important factors, as well as ensure that individuals are considering the range of other factors that may affect their success in the programs, like, the program's duration, the program's overall cost, whether or not it is a credit-bearing option or not. And again, how these factors play out for any given individual will vary tremendously based on the point in time in their career, how many more years they expect to work, how much of a career transition do they need to make? Is it a totally new sector? Is it just sort of brushing up on some new skills and things like that? But again, the capacity is just not there to provide these services, these supports on the scale at which we know people need them and can benefit from them, and will continue to need them, especially in the context of a constantly evolving economy, right? Like we are all talking, we've all heard about the need for lifelong learning, that we all need to become lifelong learners, that on average, we may experience now 20 career changes over the course of our lives. That's the environment in which, towards which we're headed. And that would require a much more robust infrastructure to support individuals at all stages of their life as they're making decisions about careers and about upskilling and reskilling and the like. Absent these supports, what I've observed from my research and primarily the qualitative components of the studies I've done, is that absent these supports, individuals are more likely to base their decisions on the marketing of these, of the training providers, and their word of mouth, from their friends. And the truth is that is just not a strategy to ensure a robust return on investment for individuals or for society as a whole on investments in training. So that just some thoughts.
Yeah, my typical story about this is, when the metro here in DC used to run, you'd ride the metro, and on the course of my trip, you would see 3, 4, 5, 6 advertisements for various education and training programs. And that there are a lot of people making decisions on which ad they saw last on the day they had a bad day at work and were deciding where to go. And that's just not a viable, option here.
Right.
So I 100% agree with Irma that we need more resources in the public system. We need better counseling and better coaching systems across the board. And some of the work that Markle Foundation and Skill Up have been doing to try and really bring that message home is absolutely on par. I would also point, though, to we've got the ability, and some of the work that we're doing at Credential Engine is to bring new data tools to bear and to bring those to the market that don't just take some of the traditional data we have, but put it in new linked formats. And the analogy I always use for this is, if you're lucky enough to be able to travel again soon, and you hop onto Expedia and you're making those great travel arrangements to go to Hawaii, and you need to get in your car and you pull up Waze and you want to get to the airport quickly, and you get into Waze, and all of a sudden 5 miles down the road, there is an accident that you don't even see yet. But Waze tells you about the accident, and Waze suggests for you different ways to get around that accident to get to the airport, because your flight is now leaving a half an hour early and you need to get to the airport quickly, and you have to count on Waze and Expedia to tell you this information. We can do the same thing in this pathway world with better data structures that allow a learner to see that the pathway that they've mapped out for themselves all of a sudden changed because the company they thought they were going to go work for shut down because COVID-19 hit. And your pathway shows a break, or the community college you were going to go to no longer offers the course you needed at the time you needed, and your pathway has a break in it. And we need these modern tools to be able to ways you around those breaks in your pathway. And it's very possible. We're doing this now with a number of states. They're publishing their information about credentials and competencies and pathways and transfer and links to jobs and quality assurance and outcome data, earnings and employment outcome data, all in modern data formats that allow you to build those kind of Expedia and Waze tools. Now, it's not the same as buying a car or, you know, booking an airline ticket. We need the coaches to help with that. These are big structural changes in your life. They're massive implications. So we need both. But I would say the first thing we need to do, or one of the first things we need to do, is to insist on better data being transparent and open to the public, so we can be building these kind of tools. And I'm pleased to say that there are a number of states that are right now in this legislative session taking steps to ensure that all of this data about all these credentials and their critical aspects, their characteristics, are made transparent and public in these new data formats. So you can begin to see these tools being built, and the federal government seems interested as well. It's a step. It's not the only step.
Yeah.
We also need to start a new panel, right? We need new panels that are able to take advantage of new data sets. We need to have all of these things brought to bear so we can be improving not only what we know, but how we're actually serving people better.
Thank you so much. And piggybacking on Kim's question that came up in the chat, I was also thinking, so you're starting to talk about some policies around framing the ways that we look at data. What are policies that also take into consideration equity and also funding as it relates to equity to support individuals equitably as they try to navigate this really challenging world to find the best solution for themselves? Either of you.
I'm happy to go ahead. So I think, you know, Kim did the very important first thing, is to just raise the question and then force the question up front to say, where do we know data has been misused, misrepresented, miscollected in order to perpetuate or to obscure inequitable understanding about the marketplace and behaviors of and toward people in the marketplace.
Yeah.
There is, to my knowledge, some work being done now, both in California and Colorado, to try and understand how you can build kind of equity and mobility scorecards of credentials to have a better idea about which credentials actually have demonstrated impact in moving people out of and up in terms of mobility for different populations that should be built into these kind of data systems and built into the tools. There's an enormous policy conversation that has to take place around this. There's an enormous research question that has to take place around this to understand better where the problems have been in the past. And I will freely admit, this is not my area of expertise. I'm not that researcher into those data misuses and data misalignments, but we're absolutely right. We've got to understand that. So we're building in now so that you don't just duplicate and multiply the inequitable use of data that's been in place in the past and just perpetuate it into the future. Has to be asked, has to be resolved. I'm not sure I'm the expert on that front.
Yeah, and I would add, I don't think that I necessarily have answers in this area. I would highlight certainly that the data that we have available, like, tells the story about what the system we have in place now
That's right.
Generally produces, right? And and we recognize that there are inherent biases and sort of an issues of structural racism and inequality that play into the outcomes that we see. But still, beginning at least with with good information on what the average returns individuals can expect for particular programs is a better place to start in supporting decision making than hearsay or or I don't know, general opinions about, well, folks, I know folks with your characteristics, they generally do well in these kinds of jobs. I think it should be more based on good information, good data about decisions, and our support infrastructure should be based on good decisions and good data and objective information on on the outcomes of the programs and the options that we have available right now. Having said that, I think we can do more as a research community to really unpack the insights into which programs, which strategies, which models tend to be particularly effective and particularly good at and improving outcomes and providing access to good jobs, good careers in like high return occupations and industries for a wide range of populations. Generally there, I would highlight the sectoral programs and approaches appear to be particularly promising in this regard, and helping individuals of all different types of race, backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds with issues of justice involvement and the like, sort of gain entry and success into occupations and industries with strong career pathways and and again the connections to livable wage jobs that with the potential to lift people out of poverty. If that's our aim, those are the kinds of analyses that we need so that we can help guide people to the programs that can connect them to good pathways, as well as identify those that are not doing such a great job and investigate why is that, what is systematically happening within those programs, such that our population in general does not benefit from them. So I think it's an important learning agenda. There's a lot more we can and should be doing there.
Let me just one final point on that, and it's not a silver bullet, but it is, I think, a core belief that we have, is that all of this data about impacts, outcomes, pathway successes, links to jobs has to be transparent. It has to be open so that if you have, and I'll just make a quick analogy back, Irma was talking about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act system and the way that programs get onto eligible training provider lists. There's a lot of questions about how some of those programs end up on some of those lists. And some of the data about their outcomes and their impacts is not always as transparent as you'd like it to be. And if we have all of this information transparent, you can actually have very open conversations about, why did you steer someone that direction? Why does this guidance system tend to sort people this way or that way?
Right.
And look back at the data and ask that question in a very open, real-time way to say, wait a minute, I call foul. There's something going on here. But if the data is not transparent, if it's not open to everybody to be able to use, we can build, if there are algorithms that can take data and direct it in inequitable ways, there are other algorithms that can be built to check, are you actually steering people in inequitable ways, and call the question immediately to say, there's something wrong here. And again, it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't answer the fundamental underlying problem, but by having transparency and openness, you can at least have that ability for sunshine to call out the problems quickly when they come up.
Right, thank you. And in the name of transparency, I'd like to answer Brianne's question that she asked early on, just how are we defining credit and non-credit? And for the purposes of this work, non-credit was defined as any kind of credential that doesn't provide credits that can build to an associate's and ultimately a bachelor's degree, whereas credit is defined as, the opposite, building toward an associate's or bachelor's degree. I don't know if either of you have some alternative definition. And then related to that, and related to some of the conversation, we weren't able to look, in response to Courtney's question, at differences in the utility of credit and non-credit bearing programming by industry or sector, just because of the size of the sample. But certainly, akin to what Irma and Scott are discussing, I think these are important considerations, and considerations on which we do need data and analysis so we can help to guide people equitably as they're making decisions across the lifespan. So there's more questions coming in. I think now would be a great time, if you feel comfortable and are interested, going ahead and unmute yourself and ask any final questions. And as people maybe are doing that or thinking about whether they want to do it, I just will say, I think my last question to you, Scott and Irma, will be around where do we go from here? So as folks maybe, Colin, for example, your question seems great. I would love for you to just unmute and ask it and enter the conversation, or anybody else who didn't get their question in.
So I just quickly to respond to your question, or where do we go from here?
Yeah.
So I think what I would say is that as a country, like, we shouldn't lose the richness of options that exist in the United States. I think one of the greatest things about the United States is that it doesn't necessarily track people into particular careers or, trajectories early in their lives. It's a system of second chances. So in a way, the infrastructure that we have today, with like many different training and retraining options, is perfect for the world that we're living in, where people will need to be finding efficient and really productive ways of continuing to upskill and reskill over the course of their lives. But we also need like an infrastructure that will be cohesive, rationalized, like that will be understandable to people, and that where people can make sense of that overall infrastructure, and where like there are options for everybody, but that make sense and that are good quality, for people who are making decisions at the early points of their careers, who are changing careers, who need to, find a new pathway after they become displaced. And again, for that, I agree completely with Scott. We need an infrastructure of data, good data and good information to support informed decision making, to objectively look at the outcomes of programs and help evaluate sort of the quality of the options and the return on investment for the options that are available. But bottom line, a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of credential versus non-credential, certificates or degrees, is unlikely to meet the diversity of needs that I think we should continue to expect in our country, and within the context of a fast-changing economy. And if we really want to meet that diversity, we should cherish the richness, but also at the same time help individuals make sense of that richness of options that are available out there.
Thank you, Irma.
I would just say that, it is the United States. We'll never have a uniform approach to anything. And that's just the way it's going to be, right? So whether we like it or not, if we try and, from the skill standards efforts to everything else since then, we are not a country that likes to be, streamlined and pigeonholed. Innovate, and once you try and do it, innovators are going to come along and create micro credentials and digital badges and all these different kind of options and opportunities, which find a place in the marketplace. So I go back to thinking about some of the policy levers, and we would advocate for saying that if there is any program that wishes to access any public dollar at the federal or state level, I would hope that foundations and other big funders would support this, that any program seeking to issue any credential to anyone in the United States has to make all of the information about that credential open and public and fully transparent, so people can know what it is that they're choosing to opt into. And they have the ability to make their most informed decisions with good counselors, with good coaches, and with good comparable information. And we can be really rigorous about what that data should look like, what it should include, but we owe it. It's a public good to make sure that people have the information they need. And people there are both students and workers and veterans and employers and policymakers and educators to know what all these options are. With 1 million of them out there now, we owe it to people to help them be able to navigate that landscape better.
Mm-hmm.
It is actually, I think, a critical issue for policymakers to take on as we're trying to help people find their way back through a COVID economy into sustainable employment as quickly as possible. So I would leave it at that as a single place to start, a public policy commitment to transparency of credential data.
Mm-hmm.
Again, not the only silver bullet, but it is an essential piece of any of these big long-term solutions.
Great, and I would love for Colin or Kathy or Brianne or any folks who are getting really active in the chat, just join us. No need for me to be your voice.
Oh yeah, so this is Brianne. I'll ask my question, and I also have a follow-up question on my prior question that you answered, Candace. So with the non-credit bearing credentials that you studied, did you differentiate between them, like who was providing them? Like, were they provided by an employer, or were they provided in the setting of a community college? I was just a little bit curious about whether you differentiated on the non-credit side at all.
We didn't. I think that would be interesting to look into. I can't honestly remember what that variable looks like in the NLS and whether we were able to, but that would certainly be an interesting point. So thank you.
So definitely an area for the next study, maybe. And then my other question was, so in the study, were there any individuals who didn't choose to pursue advanced credentials, but still managed to advance in terms of their own mobility in their career?
That's also not something that we looked into. I'm sure that there were, and it would be interesting to look at that further about the career advancement differences across different kinds of attainment. But yeah, that's not something we were looking at.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
And just to that point, Brianne, I think it's also important there. We all hear the stories about individuals in mechatronics programs that don't complete the 2-year degree program because an employer comes in and snatches them up as soon as they complete 6 weeks shy, but they got that certificate or certification that was really the thing the employer cared about.
Right.
So I think the interesting question there for me is, how important is it that individual gets some recognized credential in the pathway to what we consider a more terminal program, like a 2 or 4 year, and how important is it that they get just that connected credential or the terminal or both, and what are the distinctions there? That's really hard to get because we don't collect data at that level of detail. But that's the kind of thing that really is going to impact policy and practice decisions in the institutions. And that's where we need to be able to get to. So great question.
What do you think about the movement towards building in an associate degree to a 4-year, like an automatic AS degree built into a 4-year degree?
Irma,
have you heard of this at all?
Yes. I have heard about it. I think it's a really interesting option. I think it reinforces what Scott, you were describing earlier, that as a country, we are moving to a system where people are demanding, more options that will give them, credentials, will give them certificates, will give them, some sort of signal of market value that will not necessarily require the 4-year degree. So I think, it's a move that definitely adds flexibility in the system. It's being responsive to something that both employers and workers are demanding. What I would say is, it's an unproven like approach. We need to study it. And in fact, I think, so we have some colleagues at AIR that are exploring opportunities to research some of these associate plus bachelor's models that are emerging. So it's a really interesting development in the overall employment and training field. And I think, we look forward to learning more about, how it works, how well it works, for whom, and, what benefits it actually imparts.
I suspect that those institutions that have gone that route early on, were doing it because they really wanted to understand the benefit to the students that they serve. We do need to know more, because part of what I worry about is that a whole lot of institutions flock to it because of the marketing, and it sounds like it's an interesting angle to give, but does it really, is it really helping people in the way we want it to?
Yeah.
My gut tells me probably yes, but my gut should not be driving public policy. I've learned that over the years.
Yeah, but I think, Scott, it connects to the issue you were saying. We really don't know. Like, for example,
Right.
Are individuals better off, because an employer swoops them off before they complete their certificate program? If
Yep.
they, if they complete the certificate and then get the job,
Right.
or get
Exactly.
the job, but like commit to completing the certificate even while they're working. These are empirical questions, sort of like there may be a short-term benefit to the individual. They get employed quickly, but maybe they're stuck with that employer because they don't have that portable credential that will give them, sort of access to other employers, and, sort of will give them entry, or the ability to transition to other like higher level occupations and opportunities within their field.
Right.
So all of these things are, are issues we need to continue to study, and it always goes back to the data infrastructure.
That's right.
That we need in order to really understand the trade-offs and the, sort of the benefits and drawbacks of, different options, and help people make informed decisions about the options that are available to them.
So anyone else from the audience? I see so many questions coming in. I'd love to empower you to ask them on your own behalf. No, you're going to force me to do it for you. All right. So I think Colin asked a really interesting question about, with the landscape changing so rapidly, what are your thoughts on the rigidity of the credit-bearing program evolutionary barriers via the accreditation process that non-credit-bearing programs are not limited by? Third-party training providers and continuing education at colleges and universities are more capable of developing education training programs relevant to rapid skills demand.
Yeah, so that is such an important question. It's such an important set of issues. Yeah. I'm not an expert in accreditation, but I know that some of the accreditation bodies are concerned about this, are, actively looking into these issues. The fact that, and the whole movement on just better data on return on investment, for all educational options, credit bearing, non-credit bearing, traditional four-year, programs. I know that this is something that the Department of Education is also looking at. So, I think all of these issues work together, and the truth is we'll need to continue to help evolve our overall infrastructure to be responsive to the needs of students, of workers, of, sort of, and of our economy, and our employers and our economy. So, just lots of important issues to continue to look at and examine and explore improvements around.
I'm not an accreditation expert either. I do know that the entire world of accreditation is itself undergoing massive transformation with the changes to the regional accreditation structures under the last administration. Most people here have either heard about or seen that the recent reports that a lot of the regional accreditors are now changing, that that they're no longer going to be regional, they're national. They are going to be competing for clients not just within their defined number of states, but across. You're going to see different accreditors taking different approaches to what accreditation looks like. Are they just accrediting institutions? Are they going to get more into accreditation of programs and credentials offered by those institutions, which would get into, Colin, your question about, back to the equipped experiment where you had non-accredited organizations working with accredited organizations to deliver joint programs. That alone is going to make an enormous difference in how programs are being designed, delivered, and offered here. So great question. I don't think we know. I don't think the accreditors know. I don't think the institutions of higher ed quite know what this is all going to shake out as. And we certainly aren't going to have any sort of a national policy reckoning on this anytime soon. I've not heard anyone who thinks that we're actually going to tackle HEA in the near term. So we're probably going to have a lot of disruption over the next couple of years before we have any sort of settling out or policy answers, coming up.
Thank you. And I'll just mention one more, a sort of a counterpoint Kathy raises to our conversation about the utility of non-credit programs providing so many options, is that the movement on community college is actually to limit options in the sense of limiting the likelihood that students enter programs and just wander around and take all these courses that never build in any particular direction. It's sort of a interesting dichotomy between these two landscapes, the more credit-bearing guided pathway and the non-credit array of options. Any final comments on the relative benefits of those strategies?
Yeah, in that regard, what kind of my reaction is that, and again, it goes back to my earlier remarks for, like a comprehensive, sort of robust system with lots of options, but that it's cohesive and coherent. Right. So what, in kind of connecting to Kathy's point, what I would highlight is that my understanding is that a lot of this movement is not just about like reducing options in the context of an individual community college, but ensuring also that the community colleges specialize in particular programs such that the network of community colleges in a particular region as a network cover the needs, but any one given college is not trying to develop programs for all of the industries and all of the, and all of the growth sectors in the regional economy. So again, it's this balance between providing options, while infusing perhaps more coherence to the system, more rationality, and the fact that, like tailoring, developing programs that are responsive to the needs of employers in real time takes effort, takes time, right, takes resources. So I view this as somewhat, productive, in fact, directions and developments. Again, a lot to learn about what it takes to do this effectively and the benefits and the outcomes, for students and industry.
And I would suspect that, guided pathways are going to be really appropriate for some people, and to Kim's point, wandering and swirling is going to be best for some others. And this goes back to really good coaching and really good counseling, really good information, so that individual understands that, okay, a guided pathway will get me through cleanly and quickly, but I'm going to end up on this path. I may not have a chance to go explore, that kind of random, elective course that lets me see a different angle, but that's what I need right now. That's what I want, and that's what I'm going to opt to do. And I've thought about it, and I've talked to my counselor, and it's the right thing. Versus, the person who opts to, I don't really quite know what I want. I've got a little bit more time. My financial situation lets me wander and explore. It's back to the ways. You can plug in. I want to take the scenic route, or I have to get to the airport. Yes. Both of them are legitimate options, but you need to be able to make them fully informed, right, and know that you have options and what the pros and cons are of those options. And I'll stop with the travel analogies now. But
I'd say Waze is not good to give you the scenic option. But
well, thank you so much. We are at time. I really appreciate you both, Irma and Scott, and also all the people who were engaged. Brianne, for going ahead and engaging the conversation herself, but also Colin, Kathy, Kim, Lori, we really appreciate all of you. So have a wonderful day, and let's keep this conversation going offline.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.